Hello and welcome to the Miko Bits show, and I'm your host, Miko Bits. I'm very excited about this show. I think we're going to cover areas like liquidity, exchange, DeFi, CeFi, institutional, retail. There's many topics to discuss, and we have a very special guest today, Aya Kantorovich from FalconX. Definitely a thought leader in the DeFi industry as well, CeFi and institutional. So I think we're going to have a really fun time. So, I think just wanted to give you guys a perspective. So we do talk about, various assets. So, this is an opinion and information show. So, it's not investment advice. So seek a licensed professional for investment advice. Before we start, if you're interested in Bitcoin and blockchain, please consider clicking that subscribe button and also click the bell so you can get notifications about future videos that I might post. Thank you. Okay, without further ado, Aya, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me, Miko.
Of
I'm
course.
super excited to be here, clearly.
No, it's fantastic. It's really great to hear from you. And, obviously you've been doing great things in the industry. I really appreciate your thought leadership, and you're definitely prodigiously connected and networked. And, I think it's great to have you on the show. So, would love to kind of
Thank
talk
you.
about, like, first off, this kind of like, one of the biggest topics in DeFi is custody, right? So, one of the biggest issues is the idea of self-custody through
hmm
mechanisms like MetaMask, whether it's institutional or whether it's retail, right? So it's a fascinating topic. So I'd love to hear about your perspectives. I think that there is a kind of non-custodial retail that's kind of surfacing in the DeFi world. So I'd love to kind of get your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So, from FalconX, we currently face only institutions. And the way that, settlement happens on the OTC institution side is on this T plus one 24-hour settlement basis. And what that means is relative to the time of the trade, you have 24 hours to settle that trade. And so you can actually think about it in a form of like credit. And the idea is because of like different risk parameters, and because we've done, let's say, balance sheet check, AUM check, in addition to having like an internal credit risk and credit score associated with your account, we give you like a net limit for that 24 hours. And so, specifically here, what's interesting is that this hasn't been available for retail. When you look on retail investments, you typically do it on exchange. And when are trading on exchange, you have to pre-fund an account. And so you're
Yeah.
tying up collateral, across all of these different exchanges. Maybe you want to do spot in your Coinbase account. Maybe though you want to trade futures in like a Kraken account. And so both of those you'll have to pre-fund. What is super cool about these like non-custodial trading platforms is that you're actually given almost this like T plus one institutional only style settlement into this like MetaMask version that's now available for retail. So it makes it, just more flexible for retail to trade, where it's not, and I know we'll dive into cross-platform margining, but it doesn't tie up your collateral as much and your capital as much on the retail side, and gives you the flexibility of now being able to trade across different protocols, almost like exchanges and platforms.
Yeah, I'm super excited about you kind of touching this theme, because one of the things that's interesting, just full disclosure, is that previously on the Miko Bits show, I had one of our Gumi Crypto's portfolio companies, which is called Credo Network. And Credo Network
hmm
actually has this kind of mechanism that allows you to avoid the pre-funding of wallets more on the institutional side, right? Which is they're using this multi-party compute network to actually create a non-institutional but decentralized custodian, right? And then it
hmm
creates an interface whereby, you can actually handle these settlement constructs, right, without pre-funding the wallet, right? So
Right.
custody, the thing that's so awesome about what's happening between DeFi and CeFi to me is that the whole concept of decentralized and centralized exchanges is just kind of BS anyway, right? So like it feels like what's happening is technology is moving up to provide real solutions for custody
Yeah.
and real solutions that make people more successful and happier and safer, as opposed to kind of these bogus religious arguments about decentralization. So I'm great. I'm glad you bringing it up.
Yeah, we love labels in the crypto industry. You chuckle as well. It's we look at some of our dexes versus centralized exchanges, and there's very much a centralized party behind some of these decentralized protocols and exchanges that
Yeah.
have on and off switches. And so I completely agree with you. We tend to label things sometimes very broadly. But yeah, 100%. I mean, even if you think about it, when you connect your MetaMask, let's say that's the wallet provider, non-custodial wallet
Yep.
provider that you're using, you can, you're still technically pre-funding in a way, but it's a little different, and it's just so much less. The risk is on you, and it's just so much less work than having to, for example, pre-fund across different exchanges again.
Well, I think that the thing that's so fascinating about this new emergent development is that, it depends on the smart contracts, and it depends on a lot of the kind of interaction models that you're associating, whether you could consider it as deployment risk or not, right? So, but I would say this, right, which is that, we're moving towards a world where we're having radically reduced counterparty risk, right? So, if you look
Mm-hmm.
at it from kind of a, like, for example, like I have a friend who runs an arbitrage fund, right? And he has this beautiful chart of how his fund does, because his fund pumps out like maybe 6% all the time, right? So Bitcoin
Yeah.
goes up, Bitcoin goes down, and he's just pumping out, and it's going beautifully. And then there's this divot, right? And so you look at his chart, and it's like 6%, 6%, 6%, bang, right? And it's kind of like, what the heck happened?
September.
Yes, what happened is exchange hack
Right.
happened, right?
Yeah.
Like he's
Yeah.
immune to the ups and downs of any priced asset because he's just doing arbitrage, right? But like
Mm-hmm.
counterparty risk is a thing, right? So like his
Mm-hmm.
exchange, one, he has many exchanges, right? Because that's what arbitrage is. But like as soon as an exchange kind of gets hacked, like that's bloody, right? So I feel like
Yeah.
the lack of pre-funding wallets and the emerging technology that kind of hybridizes DeFi and CeFi in the context of custody, it's such a great topic, and I just feel like people aren't reasoning too well. I mean, I think the topic that is probably really neat is order book versus AMM. So that might be
Mm-hmm.
maybe a better construct that helps us reason better about exchange and the activity of exchange.
Yeah, definitely. So, and at some point, I'd love to talk about impermeable loss because I do think that's another label that crypto tried to use to
Oh.
make just losses sound nice. But um,
But the thing that's so beautiful is the, like, philosophically, I would characterize myself as like a Buddhist, right? And so
uh-huh,
to
uh-huh,
me, to me, everything's impermanent. So saying your loss is impermanent doesn't help, right? It's like, well, yeah, your loss is impermanent.
right.
If you wait an infinite amount of time, maybe you'll get your gain back.
Yeah,
Question mark, right? So it's sort of
right.
it's a very disingenuous word, but I what I'd love to do is have you kind of deconstruct a little bit more about things like AMM. So I'd love to have you
Yeah.
kind of like elucidate this AMM world, because I think it's really interesting, and I think you mentioned an article about this too.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a really good piece by Arjun from Paradigm that I really like that I think does a really good job of just describing what he calls market kind of 3.0 as we move into market 4.0. And if you look at an order book right now, it's basically made up of one, the folks that are supplying liquidity when they list, the centralized exchange that is making sure is running how that supply gets listed, and then the market makers that are maintaining liquidity, in addition to, you know, folks like your friend who is running the arbitrage shop, and other folks that are trading as well. And so one of the things that's difficult to see in order books, and you can only see it once you're trading, is how much of this liquidity is real versus fake, how much of it is being run by the centralized exchange. And so there's a lot of, and you'll see this when you are trading, because let's say that you're actually making a large sell or buy, dependent on how the market ticks after that purchase, you will get to see whether or not that liquidity is real. And so it is very dependent on, I would say, very centralized players, and it's very difficult to, really have this democratized activity on centralized order books. What's really fascinating about AMMs is this ability to democratize it across everyone. And so again, it kind of goes back to like what we were discussing, even like custodial versus non-custodial wallets. It's this ease of trading for folks who are trading smaller ticket sizes, which has never really been the focus initially when you're building different instruments and investment vehicles. Like I remember when I was at Pantera 2 years ago, it was always like, how do we get institutions to come in and trade more? And right now it's more, DeFi has really been focused on like, this is what the retail wants to do, and this is what these small tickets want to engage in, and so how do we make a beautiful and easy product for that? So going back to AMM, I would say, it's really, really fascinating because there you can post your own liquidity. And so in the same way that, let's say you are, going to something like BlockFi and you're posting collateral there to earn some level of interest, you can post both sides of supply on an AMM, like let's say Uniswap or Balancer, and you would get more recently, you would get these liquidity tokens. And so you would get the token, which inherently is the interest fee and the transaction fee that all the trades take. So taking even a step back, when an exchange is managing all of the liquidity, they're taking pretty large fees, especially on retail. And that just goes back into the exchange, and that helps them run operations, that helps them, pay the employees, keep the lights on, etc. Again, not very democratic, though, if you think about the way you're spreading it across different people, and still subject to things like hacks, which we've seen with KuCoin. But if you look on, like, let's say AMMs, and I think what was done so beautifully with Uniswap is that you're still getting these really high transaction fees, especially when gas fees go up. But what's beautiful is that Uniswap was like, we're going to bring this back to the people who are supplying the actual liquidity as opposed to the centralized Uniswap organization. And so that creates more incentive for people to post the liquidity that they aren't using, and so that it can be used by folks who are trading in and out of these positions. And so in my opinion, it's like just a really cool way to get much more engagement from people who are really excited about these projects and see value in, let's say, like a Uniswap liquidity provider token. And so that, I would say, is like really the largest difference between a centralized exchange and an AMM. But one thing I will say, as someone who is a centralized liquidity provider, I don't think AMMs are going to necessarily replace, centralized exchanges anytime soon. And the reason being is that, we are still very much focused on kind of the retail side of the business here on DeFi. But if a large trader is trying to, get into a very large, like multi-million position, trying to get in and out of that position, it's very difficult to do that on an AMM. One, you need to have that supply already there posted by someone else. Two, the slippage on that is going to be really big and much harder to manage. And three, the transaction fees plus the gas fees really add up, and you can get it much cheaper and faster sometimes on a centralized exchange. And so I think the two marry each other very, very well in situations where sometimes there are less liquid tokens that you can get much easier on AMMs. You can create markets on AMMs. If you're a protocol, it's much easier to disperse your tokens in a much larger range on AMMs than it would on, for example, an exchange. So we could probably dive into all of these different things, and I'm sure I'm rambling at this point, but I really do think that AMMs are a huge step, to your point, like a huge technological step for us in the space, but so far going to marry very well to the centralized exchanges we have.
Yeah. And I think from a nomenclature perspective, to me, I think the salient kind of like contrast would be kind of AMM style versus order book style, right? And in a sense, like I think centralized exchange may not, it may be as little of a thing as decentralized exchange, right? Like in a sense, right? And I think one of the things you pointed out that I really liked is like one of the things uncovered by the KuCoin hack were how many of these so-called decentralized tokens are actually centralized, right? Because there's so many tokens that were
Yes.
like, oh, we're just going to freeze our network and we're just going to freeze those tokens that got hacked and we're just going to,
Yeah.
and it's kind of like, who's we? Like who, like what's up with that?
I actually remember we were on a different call and you and I just called it out immediately. It was like, this was supposed to be a very mathematical protocol that, once something happened, another thing was executed. And the on and off switch felt very non-mathematical per se. And so agreed, it definitely shone some light on these maybe not so decentralized. Again, going back to the labeling, we really like to label
We
things.
do. And the thing that I think is beautiful about this round of activity, and what I see is I actually see a pendulum, and the pendulum goes between almost like a religious purity, all the way back to kind of like an extreme pragmatism, right? And that it swings back and forth, right? And I think one of the beautiful things that's happening right now is that we've kind of we went towards a much more pragmatic phase in DeFi, and that the
Mm-hmm.
pragmatism actually launched something that people might even call like a bubble, where things were going bananas. And obviously, like the bubble included all of the yams and the pickles and the, bastes and all these crazy things, and I think we've kind of come back from there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that like
Yeah.
there's still like it feels to me like that the practical utilities, like I kind of joking about pickle because like pickle's a metastability, kind of mechanism. So I think it belongs in the ecosystem, right? So I feel like, there's stuff that's here to stay for sure, right? So like, I think that the next wave will grow on top of that. But I think the thing that I think I want to underscore that I'm really hearing from what you're describing that I like a lot is that ultimately it's about technological solutions and pragmatism, right? And then I think this weird religiosity around DeFi, CeFi, I think is really not helpful because decentralized exchange is not really a thing. Like if you look at something like IDEX, like it's like it has an order book, it has
Right.
KYC
Right.
AML, and it just has a different custody model, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
and that custody model may appear also in things like AMM, right? So like what is a DEX? It turns out Ether Delta, if you read the kind of SEC versus
Right.
like,
Right.
Zach Coburn, like it turns out they have a centralized order book. So what Ether Delta was supposed to be a DEX, it's like, it isn't, it wasn't. So like, and that's what they got
Right.
him on, by the way. It's like you're
Right.
matching Alice and
Right.
Bob. And furthermore, you have a centralized order book. So like, we were all kind of surprised, just like the KuCoin hack, by the way. We were
Yeah.
all surprised. We were all like, "Oh, I see."
Yes.
Or the other one that I point to that's similar is the is that one I think it was IOTA, right? So
Uh-huh.
the IOTA hack where IOTA's like, I think we're just gonna like pause transactions on the network.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, what the heck? Like you can pause everything. Like who's doing the pausing and who has the switch to pause it? It's weird. So
Right.
anyhow,
Right.
yeah. So
Yeah.
let's swing over. So one of the things that's fascinating to me is that the pragmatism is real and it's really wonderful. But one of the things that I think we have to touch is the emergence. So I think it was yesterday that the Department of Justice published a cryptocurrency enforcement framework, right? It's I think, 87 or so page document. I did give it a little bit of a perusal, and
Quite the read.
it is. It's a good read, and in the context of what's happening with like McAfee getting arrested in Spain, which is an extradition country. Sorry about that. And then obviously Arthur Hayes and his crew.
Right.
They did pick up the CTO in Massachusetts, so like that's another DOJ enforcement. So like if you look at all of this stuff happening, I guess the thing I wanted to swing towards is kind of privacy tokens, right? Because that's because privacy tokens maybe they made a star appearance in this context of this like DOJ enforcement
Right.
framework, right? So I guess I want to hear from you around privacy tokens and things like the Bank Secrecy Act and regulation. So how do you feel about privacy tokens?
Yeah. Well, so even taking a step back, I think going back to the DOJ actually putting out, a list of this is, good policies to have and a great framework to follow, I think is a huge step in the right direction. It means that people are actively working on it in the government. It means that, the SEC chairman came out saying that we can expect a tokenized future. I mean, this is pretty big. This is really big news for us. And so, I completely understand by the SEC wanting and the DOJ wanting to make sure to protect U.S. citizens who are getting involved in these transactions, and that's all we can hope for from our legal agencies. And so, going specifically to privacy tokens, the issue here. And I actually had a really good conversation with the founder of the Bulletproof paper. But the issue here is that the tech is actually the easiest part of these really interesting privacy tokens. The hardest part is the human aspect of it. It's the regulation, it's the tracking, it's the auditing, it's the accounting. It's all of these human barriers that we put on top of tech to make sure that it's regulatory compliant. And so we, for privacy tokens, we don't touch them. And the reason we don't is specifically for what you mentioned, Bank Secrecy Act. We can't KYC it. We can't track, how many wallets that these privacy tokens have touched. We can't see where the transactions have happened. If it's bank secrecy specifically, if it's touched a wallet that's been blacklisted by the U.S. government. And I think that's, the largest charge against Arthur Hayes is specific to, sanctioned wallets and Iran. And that's not a game you want to play at all with the U.S. government. And so, this is some pretty serious stuff. And I think that's the largest hesitation for anyone who's, regulated. I mean, again, going back to my initial point, if we really want larger institutional capital entering the space, Square is not going to touch. They're just not going to touch privacy tokens, and we're not going to see S&P 500 companies touch privacy tokens because they're regulated. And so I think we need to keep this in mind. There's some really interesting stuff happening out there that, maybe it's private for specific users, but you can, give access to, different players if they want access to that data. And so again, apparently, something that sounds really easy for you and me is really difficult to create on the tech side. And so, there's Snarks technology that's working on it, that there's folks like Starkware who have been working on this for 3 or so years now. And so really, really interesting projects, but it's not an easy solution to solve in terms of managing, how private is it? But I think at large, right now, it's something where how private do you need your, if you really want privacy tokens, that's great. I hope you're offshore entity and you're not a US citizen. So that's at least, how we're looking at it right now.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like privacy tokens did actually get star treatment in the enforcement letter, in the enforcement report, right? Which is, it's sort of wow, that's not really a thing. I mean, I'm a co-founder with Evercoin Exchange, and we do have certain things on the exchange like Dash, right? But we have unshielded Dash. Right. So it's possible to get kind of exposure to an asset, but in an unshielded mode. Right. If it's an unshielded mode, it absolutely cannot be used for money laundering, because you can just get Chainalysis or any kind of elliptic, whatever you want, and you could just look at it and be oh, I see what happened here. This went over here, and then it was
Yeah.
So I think there is that, right? But I think the thing that we're really talking about are the shielded modes, or Monero, or these other assets that are kind of to me, that's a big thing. And I think another potentially big thing are kind of these so-called decentralized AMMs, because the thing that I think is bad about sort of this, I think back in the day, there used to be this distinction of utility coin versus security coin token.
Right. Yes.
And that was another incredibly bad way of looking at the world, right? Because people would say stupid things in the ICO era. And by the way, this is coming back to haunt them even today, right? Which is that they said something like, my coin has a utility, therefore it can't be a security, therefore I'm going to ignore the SEC, right? And that was kind of oh, wow, good luck with that, right? That kick messenger, just look at what's happening, right? And open your eyes.
Yeah.
It's not a thing, right? And so to wind that towards the other concern, right, which is kind of super unrelated, is that people are saying, I'm decentralized, therefore I don't pass the Howey test, therefore I don't need to worry about regulators. Right, and they're conflating the SEC with FinCEN, and they're conflating it with OFAC. Like the SEC generally doesn't show up with guns, like it's FinCEN and OFAC. Like those are the regulators that are serious, right? Because they're worried about terrorist financing, and they're worried about like things that are worrisome.
Fair. Yeah. I mean, they're here to, I completely agree with you. They're here to protect us. And at the end of the day, like if we want crypto to be larger than just, Silicon Valley hanging out on Uniswap, then like, we need to take this really seriously. And if you sit in the US, if you're marketing to US clients, if you're in any way, shape, or form, onboarding US entities, then this is something you need to take really seriously. If you don't want to market to the US market, that is your choice completely. And, the US government is saying, like, that's totally cool. You can market internationally and, follow other jurisdictions' laws. But if you start touching the US, then like we have a few rules that you need to abide by. And at the end of the day, from even the FalconX position, how we've seen it is we've had clients reach out to us and they're like, hey, we like really want to buy things like Uni, and we'll buy it if there's a natural buyer or seller, but I'm in no way, shape, or form comfortable, and my limited partners and board aren't comfortable with signing off on me touching an AMM because of the things that you just mentioned and we mentioned previously. And so again, this is large capital that's staying out of the space, specifically because of the risks that come with, things just not being very clear on whether or not, it abides by now the DOJ's 86-page reference letter.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I really appreciated, like right around page 37, they start digging into kind of almost like a taxonomy of concern areas, right? And that to me was like the most illuminating, right? Because in a way, all of this is reflective of the sort of best contemporary thinking inside the agency, right? Because obviously they publish this with fanfare, right? And, if you look at that and it's on their website and they did a press release and they're like, read our thing, right? And so because of that taxonomy of concern, we're able to look at it and be like, well, what do they care about? And it's like, mixers, ATMs, like we don't like privacy coins, stuff like that, right? So they just laid it out. They're like, here's what we're looking at, and generally they're also thinking like, well, we'd love all the exchanges to register with FinCEN, and be an MSB, right? So the thing that's really untraveled is this kind of like, if you're providing a so-called decentralized exchange through AMM, like who's registering with FinCEN, like, and who's filing SARs on behalf of your DEX? Question mark.
Yeah. And what worries me most, I think, about these players too, is that they sit primarily in the US. So, these are not international companies. These are companies sitting on, Market Street in San Francisco. And so this is something that I would be pretty concerned about if I was, in their position. But I think at large, if there were ever cryptocurrency lawyers in blockchain that were nervous about job security, this really helped them out. There are now 86 pages of things that all of us need to abide by. And so at least, that's helping the space out for sure.
Yeah, it's going to get, I think that area and domain is going to get hot. And, obviously not to conflate the SEC at all with the other regulators, and Bank Secrecy Act with Howey, the SEC precedent for this is Ether Delta, and it isn't even to do with Ether Delta. It's actually to do with Zach Coburn. Like it's like they went after an individual, in this case on U.S. soil, but like extraterritorial is totally on the table, right? But like they basically got this person for writing open source software, basically. Like it's like, you shouldn't have written that. So like, wow, really? Like, okay, that's a little unnerving. So let's swing over to,
and quickly, actually, to that point, I will
please.
just say that, as much as I sound like I'm super pro regulation, I do think it's definitely a little unfair, the reaction that, folks like JP Morgan had, and just these massive fines that they paid for very sketchy things that they did recently with regards to how they were auditing and allocating funds that could have been perhaps money laundering, but if that happens in crypto, then you just get shut down. And so I definitely think there is a very unfair balance in terms of the treatment that banks get in this country relative to obviously crypto, but I will say this is a bit more friendlier jurisdiction than others out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is right now a very active separation of kind of wheat from chaff, type of thing going on. So, I think that the industry is kind of making an effort to kind of straighten up and clean up. And, I think that, these are, you should definitely look at these actions like BitMex as being sort of warning shots, so if you're anywhere over there, you should think about this stuff. Any other stuff on privacy and regulation?
No, as much as I love diving into regulation.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't also want to be necessarily, a apologist for kind of the regulatory regime, but at the same time, like, we all have to be, if we're operators in the space, we have to be very conscious. And to be perfectly blunt, like, the thing that makes me align with some of the regulatory stuff is that there are seriously bad actors, and those seriously bad actors should be removed from the space so that the space can grow in a more healthy way. So, that's something I don't oppose. So, one of the things that's so fascinating, that's kind of coming onto the scene is more about central bank digital currencies and, stable coins, so I'd love to have your commentary on this emerging phenomenon. 'Cause like that's real potentially heavyweight liquidity and legitimacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And this also ties into, and I'd love your thoughts at some point if whether or not we're headed towards the Bitcoin ETF in the US, but I know, yeah, I know this all ties in together. But on the topic of CBDCs, I think this is something that we've heard quite a bit on in the last year or so. But as most things on the government level just tends to move a little bit slower. And I think one thing that I've heard is an argument I heard recently was with regards to, why would you use stablecoins as opposed to CBDCs? And the answer is that they're just not out yet, and they're not here. And we don't know if they're going to be here in 6 months and 12 months. There's another potential stimulus check that's coming out hopefully in the next few weeks. But if that stimulus check does go out, one thing I think this country hasn't realized is what learnings can we make from how the last stimulus check went out, how a lot of people couldn't access it because they didn't have a bank account. People couldn't afford the ATM fees to like cash it out. People didn't have access, either it was like digital version of getting the check, or the wrong address was on the check. I mean, it was just like the list just goes on in terms of how people couldn't access their federal stimulus check. And so now we're about to send out a new one, but it doesn't seem to me like we've made any changes. And the CBDC was supposed to inherently help with this, and it's not here. And so I think to the point about stablecoins, I mean, the volumes kind of speak for themselves. It's been a really, really easy way to you find a fiat on and off ramp. You're able to move your money around into these different protocols. And again, it goes back to just ease of payments and ease of trading, and ease of sending money. I always go back to this reference, but I just find it ultimately so bizarre that to move money from Venmo to PayPal, which is the same company, takes 2 days. And stablecoins, it's immediate. And so you can always transfer back to USD, and you can pay taxes on it and account for it. That's not at all the purpose, but what's great is that it's fast. You can get it immediately. And I think CBDCs are lagging. We're seeing a lot of movement happening with the digital yuan right now, and a lot of news there. To how much of that is true, I don't know per se personally, but I think the longer that it takes for us to push out CBDCs in this country, the more sentiment's going to be pushed to why not just stablecoins.
Yeah, and I think that that's really something that is part of the renaissance in DeFi, right? Which is the emergence of this construct of stable coins, and I think Vitalik called it sort of a killer application in Ethereum, right? And it is a wonderful mechanism, and I think obviously one of the things, so I had a conversation a little bit about, dipping a toe back towards regulation of like who might be next, if you look at the
Oh
BitMex and you
yeah,
look at all these different things, and like the Bitfinex tether was actually came up,
yeah,
so in
yeah.
terms of stable assets, like, I had a show with Origin Protocol, and they were talking about OUSD, and so there's a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah.
potentially really neat innovation that kind of presages the emergence. Another guest that we had on the show were the Brightmans, and I talked to them about Societe Generale's attempt to use the technology, right, of Tezos on behalf of the French government for a
Uh-huh.
CBDC project, right? So it's
Wow.
fascinating
Uh-huh.
to see different world governments kind of beginning the experimentation, because I think we also even have examples of kind of non-central banks that are issuing stable coins. So for example,
Mm-hmm.
my fund is an investor in Tacit, who supplies the CBDC for, or not CBDC, it supplies the stable asset for Signet, right, which is a
Mm-hmm.
bank
Mm-hmm.
issued US dollar stablecoin, right? So like, so I think that it's in a way just we're all kind of circling around this emergence of this kind of mass adoption and legitimacy event, right? So I think that, the thing that I think I'm hopeful about this time is I'm hopeful that this kind of preliminary cleanup act will lead towards these kind of legitimate, infusions of capital and governments and everyone else. I mean, I think the thing you
Mm-hmm.
were alluding to earlier is you commented about ETF, right? So the thing that's been fascinating, if you read the kind of back and forth between the SEC and the kind of ETF applications, is really that they've been concerned about kind of the quality of the underlying market, right? So they're
Mm-hmm.
basically like, yeah, we think that this is a manipulated market, and if you think Bitcoin's a manipulated market, you kind of have to look at Tether. But let's say you do, right? As a regulator, let's say you
Mm-hmm.
do look
Mm-hmm.
at it, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
only one of two
Yeah.
options, right? The two options is that they did do something, in which case they're kind of in trouble, and or the other option is they didn't and they're fine, right?
Right.
And if they're
Right.
fine,
Right.
then at that point I feel like you may have a green light for something like an ETF, and I think we're already past the comfort zone of like, Hester Pierce, who said that like, why is the United States getting involved in like judging assets, right? Like, isn't that what investors should be doing? And so I think, so we are going to reach, I think, a tipping point.
Yeah, absolutely. Crypto mom.
Yes.
No, but yeah, I completely agree. I think, going back to Tether, even, any exchange right now that has their own stable coin, FTT, for example, BNB for Binance, these folks are worried. This is going to be something that they are probably concerned about in terms of how the tokens get dispersed, how centralized are these tokens, how much FTT does FTX hold, and things like that. And so this is now all under what feels like review. But yeah, to your point too, I think it just depends on what is the CBDC going to be used for. We're moving away from, and one thing that I found really interesting, I was recently on a panel with a woman from UNICEF, and she was like, "Oh, we have, this investment vehicle that's just BTC and ETH." And I was like, "Okay, well, no stable coins." And I was like, "Why no stable coins? Nothing US denominated." And it was like, "Oh, well, because the projects are just running on Bitcoin and ETH. They're not running on stable coins." And, to that point, sometimes we're very much also in kind of our bubble of, we're using it because, one, we live in the US, and so that's the most immediate fiat on and off ramp. That's easy. And then obviously, a lot of the yield farming and DeFi was also very much built on stable coins. But for some of these more real world use cases, in projects in Malawi, for example, they're using Bitcoin and ETH. And so even taking a step back, it's what do we need these for? And even going back to CBDCs, and for specific banks, as you mentioned, it could be just because a bank. So BBVA is doing a lot of work with, they have time struggling moving assets between different branches. So maybe they want to move assets to South America, and it takes a lot of time. But this is a big bang; it needs to happen immediately. And so, I think there's a lot of concerns around just being able to move assets quickly. It doesn't need to be something that accesses maybe all Americans, and if it does, then CBDC's they have to catch up, because the more stimulus checks we have on just US dollars, it's gonna be an issue, I think.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think people are, like Andrew Yang is talking about UBI, universal basic income. So like as we start to sort of see these kind of advanced conversations about stimulus and stimulus becoming kind of like an endemic kind of construct for, social welfare, I think we're going to see, this is very much kind of not now far future prognostication, but, even seeing interbank transfer between Belt and Road, and looking at Belt and Road countries and looking at what's happening with kind of African debt, cycling back to infrastructure projects from China. Like if you want to, if you're looking at this election and you're looking at this kind of like Biden kind of New Deal economics around infrastructure investment, like China's doing that as an expansionistic agenda, right? So if you see, central banks across Africa connected to Beijing through, CBDC, like that becomes very geopolitical very fast, right? And the petrodollar
absolutely
experiences extreme competitive pressure. So I think that's hyper macro. So, I definitely think that's important. But I think the point you made that I think is super important for everyone to kind of contemplate is you were talking about Malawi projects that are purposefully utilizing Bitcoin and Ether and other international projects. And to me, I think that that's a harbinger. And the thing that I think is a sign of financial maturation is that people are really thinking about the exposure to these assets as being a treasury management issue as opposed to anything else, right? So the point being that we're seeing kind of MicroStrategy, and now most recently we saw Square buying $50 million worth of Bitcoin. Those are treasury management moves, right? So in other words, it's kind of like go ahead is the feeling, right? The feeling is not, and so the thing that's beautiful about that is that it's all about appropriateness, right? It's not about kind of like, oh, well, because what we saw in ICO is we saw everyone managing 100% of their treasury in Ether, and we saw how well that went, right? Like it was a disaster, right? And, and so it's basically like, well, okay, that's immature. That's immaturity, right? Now, if you look at something like a Malawi project using Ether, like, that's a choice. They could do that. They could do something else, right? And it's basically like the flexibility's there, the choice is there, and they're making that choice, and it could be awesome, right? So like, good for them. And Square's making that choice. MicroStrategy's making that choice. And like, I saw a tweet today that was basically like, it's a 3-step equation for all public companies, right? Which is, invest in Bitcoin, announce that you've invested in Bitcoin, profit. Right, in the sense of like when Square announced
make an ETF of all of these public traded companies that are invested in Bitcoin.
Yeah, you announce it and it'll pop, right? So it's kind of like, gee, free money for Jack, right? Like, wow, great
absolutely.
Playbook.
Yeah, and even going back, I love international affairs. That's my background in nature, and so going back to like the geopolitical point, I think is super interesting. I 100% think we previously spoke about just like an arms race of technology, and I think that's 100% what's going to happen here. And the time where the U.S. really works quickly is when there is that type of geopolitical pressure out there, and I think that's initially why CBDCs has gotten so much time and space in the US. I think, to your point, the minute that starts expanding into infrastructure projects, not only in like Eastern Africa, but China has it all over Southeast Asia. And so it's really huge. And the US is so far behind. It's going to be interesting to see, what is the geopolitical event that really, flips the switch. And suddenly the US is like, we got to get this out now kind of moment. And so it's going to be cool. It's going to be really cool. And then to the treasury management piece, I'm waiting for the PayPal announcement next.
Well, I think the thing that's so interesting connecting these dots is I think you might have been there at the Pantera meeting, at the LP meeting when Commissioner Giancarlo from CFTC, like
Mm-hmm.
former,
Mm-hmm.
he spoke, and right, and his thing that was so fascinating is he took credit for Bitcoin coming down from the all-time highs, right? Because he was basically like, what happened
Yes.
is that we launched regulated futures, and these people were able to short the hell out of the thing, and we bashed it back down, right? Which to me is so fascinating, right? Because to me, the thing that's so interesting about the psychology of it is kind of like buying time, right? So to me,
Mm-hmm.
the thing that's so interesting is it may be that Giancarlo, through that enforcement action and that regulatory action, actually bought time for things like BSA, IRS, DOJ investigators, OFAC investigators to do what they're doing now, right? Which is kind of trying to
Yeah.
clean house, right? And that if they do clean house, then it may be that that's the royal road to introduce CBDC, right? Because I think
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
point is spot on, right? Which is that, why did the United States put like Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, put those people on the moon, right? It's basically the Russians, right? Like that's what happened, right? It's sort of Sputnik and the kind of the space race, right? As soon as China kind of like shows their CBDC, and all of a sudden what's happening is like zero, it'll be effectively zero fee, like central bank to central bank settlement that's kind of near
Right.
instantaneous, right? So if you
Yep.
look at like African nations, they're going to be part of this how would I say, like a federation or confederacy.
International network. Yeah.
Yeah, and the power of it, right? Because if you look at what the
Right.
United States did in kind of more of the like expansionistic phase of our sort of economy, what the United States did in Latin America was really third world debt, right? Was really
Mm-hmm.
about
Mm-hmm.
this kind of like control paradigm, and like in a
Right.
sense, like we're seeing a replication of that in with China moving and with Belt and Road, right? So like
Right. Right.
that
Right.
sphere of influence is absolutely going to be strategic. And when you look at
Mm-hmm.
African nations, the adoption of Bitcoin in places like Nigeria, which will soon have a larger population than the United States, and these emerging markets, it's astonishing what will happen,
Mm-hmm.
and that Bitcoin will play a role. And also, potentially, China will play a role. So as soon as those things start to happen, I think the U.S. will have to wake up. And I think former Commissioner Giancarlo of CFTC, like I think he's definitely long-term a proponent, and long-term he's speaking at the Pantera event, right? Like you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like he's not anti.
Right. Right. No, that's a really interesting, I never took it in that point of view. I think it's mostly because of the tone that he likes to give these messages across. That felt more like a haha, I'm pushing my CBDCs first. I was like, wait a second. But no, I completely agree with you. That could be really interesting. I mean, the biggest question too is just infrastructure takes time, and infrastructure for legacy systems takes even more time. And so, to your point, if there is a network that's currently being built in a geopolitical sense, and suddenly the US comes out with theirs, I mean, it's going to be right. We talk about this in SaaS businesses all the time, B2B. What's the switching costs going to be like for these companies and across different countries? And is this just going to be an internal settlement tool, or is this going to be something larger? And what's the benefits of it? And I think you hit it all on the head. We're turning into B2B SaaS investors on this call, but it's going to be really interesting to see how that impacts even state by state in the US. I mean, everything in this country is really, really broken on the financial aspect of it. So it's going to be interesting to see what CBDCs even does, in the US before we even start to expand elsewhere.
Yeah, I do think that's going to be an incredible kind of doctrinal movement within the regulatory paradigm, simply because when you look at kind of things like MTL, money transmission, it's absolutely state by state. And, you're seeing BitLicense in New York, and you're seeing all these kind of very weird kind of exceptional patterns that I think are going to be long-term obstructive to the formation of any kind of like federal response, right? And so,
Right.
that's definitely due for cleanup. And I think that national competitiveness is the issue, and I think that that's been the battle cry of the Libra project, right? Which is that, they're very, David Marcus has been very clear in his congressional testimony about China, and that's their game.
Yeah.
That's their playbook, is basically like, watch out, it's China. And, and I think he's basically saying that the West is going to respond not through this kind of hyper-centralized, monolithic authoritarianism, but rather through these kind of commercial arms like Facebook, right? So that's right. His kind of, and he's very careful not to say Facebook. He's very careful to say Libra right. Association and all of its decentralized participants, blah blah blah. But it's Facebook.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. I just think it's crazy, the sort of rise and honestly the fall of Libra. From our perspective, it's just, countries don't want their currencies to be bundled up, and then suddenly there be this independent, party that's running this international stable coin. I think at the end of the day, if it was something that, maybe bring power back to the UN, but if it's something that's, managed by some international party where every country has some level of say in it, I think that's a different use case completely. But let's start with the conversation of who trusts Facebook anymore. So I think what will be interesting is, going back to the WePay aspect that we discussed about in China, WhatsApp is a huge product. It's a huge product in places like India. And so that was initially why, Libra came to fruition. It was this idea of, we need to have some sort of payments aspect within our products for people to send like Venmo like payments, and then take that and put that into Messenger, and so it'll be interesting. I think WePay is a very easy option that works really well when you're in China. You can discuss whether or not you believe that it should be centralized with the government, but it's going to be interesting to see, to your point, how some of these companies start pushing that payments platform across.
Well, and it becomes such an interesting geopolitic, because you start to see these kinds of like civilizational clashes emerging in the kind of political milieu, and you start to see protectionism around things like TikTok, and you start to see these kind of really crazy things like the ban of like WeChat, and then you start to see other things like the government of China announcing that they have launch partners for their CBDC, and that the launch partners include WeChat and include Tencent and Alipay, right? Alibaba, right? And so it's kind of like, and then explicitly thanking Libra and Facebook, right? Explicitly saying, oh, thanks for that idea. Like, we're going to do that too. We're going to have launch partners too, right? It's like, which is so crazy, right? It's kind of like Facebook did it, and so China will do it, and it's like, oh yeah, like we're copying Facebook. Head explodes, right?
But like, why not? It goes back to the tech arm race. If it creates, more centralized power, but also just like ease of use, then why not?
And distribution.
I mean, imagine just being like a centralized party now seeing everything that you purchase on all of these different platforms, and it's just, all you have to do is look up your user ID and wallet.
But when you see the mix of players on the China side, it's so fascinating, right? Because when you look at the players, it's almost like the government of China is like, what we need distribution partners. So, Alibaba and like, Tencent are going to be our distribution arm, right? But at the same time, like the Chinese government will be a marketing arm, right? Because like Chinese government has like, we have a lot of
That's a great way to frame it. Yeah.
So it's sort of like, holy cow. And I think all of this was born with like the previous generation of Chinese leadership, including like Deng Xiaoping, who basically said, I don't care if it's a capitalist cat or a communist cat, as long as it catches mice, right? And it's kind of like, ooh, whoa. Ooh. Like we're in a new era. And and I think the protectionism and the petrodollar and the geopolitics and Iran gate and everything else, it's sort of like, what's next? It's really
I almost
epic.
think though, like in the US, we tend to make ourselves believe that we don't live in a very similar world. But if you think about it, Amazon knows everything you track, and now it's connected to Whole Foods, so they know what you eat. And, Alexa is just like listening to all your conversations and advertising on your phone. And the US government, if they need to, have access to that data whenever they want. And so, we're not that far off. Definitely, there's a lot more checks and balances, I would say, in place to protect your data, and this idea of like potentially needing a warrant. But apart from that, I think data is, we can spend hours probably discussing on data getting commoditized, but it'll be interesting to see if crypto gets to a place where people can own their own data, as opposed to it being owned by government and its partnership partners.
Well, and we see wonderful emergent models, right? Like, for example, if you look at the Brave browser, which I'm a user
Mm-hmm,
of, like, that's a
mm-hmm,
beautiful
mm-hmm,
model. And when you look at their
mm-hmm.
opt-in advertisement paradigm, the data resides locally, and like the crawlers that decide whether to show you an ad are not actually, they're local too, right? They're all executing
Right,
locally.
right,
So,
right.
so it's your data telling the ad network to show an ad or not, right? And that's not being processed centrally. It's processed decentralized. So like, so I would say that like it isn't a fantasy. It's a beginning, right? It's super small, right?
Absolutely.
I mean,
Yeah,
obviously
yeah.
Brave is both big and small, but like, if you want it to be, like, but it's something that is real, right? It's a real start.
Yeah, yeah. And it is a faster use case browser. I will say that I one time had to win tickets to climb up a volcano, and I put it both on my Chrome browser and Brave, and the Brave won the ticket. So
That's
let's go Brave.
great. What a terrific use case. And it's proven. Yeah, I'm a
It's
fan.
proven.
I'm a fan. And full disclosure, I have a small ICO basket of bats. So, like, I'm a believer. I think they've done a wonderful job. Brendan Ike is like great technical leader, and, he's done
Yeah,
some
the team
wonder
is
things in
phenomenal.
his career. So,
Absolutely.
credible people, and obviously not investment advice at all.
Yeah.
Um,
Asterisks.
Yeah, well, this is great. And, I think we unpacked a lot of terrain, a lot of questions, and a lot of kind of rich domains to further unpack. So, I think would love to have you back. And, there's any number of topics we can unpack. But, like, this has been a really great conversation. Really, really appreciate it.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Miko. This was so fun.
Okay, thanks so much. Bye.